I was asked to address the project, the Green Room, Reconsidering the Documentary and Contemporary Art that Adam mentioned, and I will do so in parallel with talking about another curatorial project that I've been involved with called Abstract Possible, and trying to think through these artworks that are involved in both projects, what documentary and abstraction might or might not have to do with each other. A life-size bronze cast of a woman's head and a text saying female, Asian, height 5 feet 2 inches, age 25, at least one advanced pregnancy, are two of the most palpable parts of Christine Borland's project From Life. Despite engaging a number of professionals like forensic scientists and osteologists, all information that could be obtained from a skeleton which the artist had purchased was these 5 basic facts. A so-called police artist was then commissioned to sculpt a head according to the methods which he normally uses to reconstruct the look of someone for a criminal investigation. In From Life, a set of human bones is the rather disturbing starting point for a process whose purpose it is to establish the identity of a person who once walked the earth. And it should be mentioned that Christine Borland purchased this skeleton fully legally in London in the early 90s. As you can imagine, it was not a European skeleton, but a skeleton from India. It's no longer legal. So From Life is an extensive project consisting of a series of straightforward documentations like slides and videos from the examinations of the skeleton, as well as samples of TV documentaries and other images from popular culture dealing with identification processes. In the original manifestation of the project at Tramway in Glasgow in 1994, the skeleton was also included, and as a visitor you could enter one of 3 so-called porta cabins, or little huts where normally construction workers would change clothes and have lunch, etc. The skeleton was also included. And as a visitor, you could enter one of the 3 porta cabins and freely touch the bones still kept in the cardboard box in which they were acquired. So certainly archaeology, anatomy, and identity politics are points of references in this project. Almost as indexical as a traditional photograph, and partly more bodily than a fingerprint, the project plays with the classical function of the document as evidence in legal processes and scientific research. Even the driest and most rigorous registration ends up frustrating expectations about clear answers on the status of things. And the insistent question is, what are the truth claims operating in this particular work? And I would like to extend this to be a general question about documentary practices. What are the truth claims operating? As a form of documentary based on a variety of media, From Life attests to the fact that today documentary practices, whether lens-based or not, are profoundly ambivalent about rhetorics of truth and strategies of authenticity. Not only are documentary practices one of the most significant developments within art of the last 2 decades, it is also one of the most complex tendencies which continuously has challenged and reinvented itself. So rather than being merely neo-objectivist, it combines a desire to touch the real with a need to do so with an unambiguous awareness about the impossibility of doing so. So the documentary practices involved in the exhibition, The Green Room, Reconsidering the Documentary and Contemporary Art, employed a variety of media, and they did so without sharing one single formal style. And as somebody said earlier today, neither could they be described as a genre. They range from found footage, video reportage, and essayistic installations to filmed reenactments of real events and text-based printed matter. They also included sculpture and performance. So clearly, the rhetorical strategies varied, borrowing both from the orator and the historian, both from somebody making a claim based on opinion, a statement, and somebody who's trying to tell the story of the past based on documents. And yet, we can think of them as having a critical sensibility in common. Many of them search for suitable forms and methods to discuss social content, whether historical material or effects of recent political and economic upheaval. So at the time, in 2008, when the exhibition was up at the Hesse Museum at Bard College, such innovative documentary forms were abound, and there was a certain number of exhibitions and other projects dealing with documentary and practices and contemporary art. It felt very much as if the phenomenon was not properly discussed and theorized. So the exhibition project, which extended and also included a reader, a series of courses at the Center for Curatorial Studies, and a think tank group, it was an attempt to bring questions about this powerful development to the fore and to stimulate a debate about the nature of representation in the early 21st century. And some of the questions that kept coming back, not least in this little think tank, which met prior to the exhibition, also during the exhibition, and each of the participants in the think tank was invited to teach a different course at the Center for Curatorial Studies, were people like Walid Rath, Hito Steierl, Carles Guerra, and Petra Bauer, and Matthew Buckingham. So some of the questions we returned to were these. What is the function of documentary art forms in the context of globalizing media and an expanding art world? What is the relationship of fact and fiction, media and mediation in these documentary practices? What role does the archive and issues of copyright play? And how do the operations of documentary forms change in the age of digital reproductions? So works by more than 40 artists were brought together, and these works literally permeated the Center for Curatorial Studies, the library, the corridors, the seminar room, as well as the designated exhibition spaces in the Hessel Museum. I'm going to take you through some of the works in the exhibition so that you can get a sense of what the context was like. The film November by Hito Steierl, the essay film based on montage where she is trying to find out what happened to her childhood friend who went to fight with the PKK in Kurdistan, a friend with whom the artist happened to have made her very first attempts at filmmaking as a teenager. So at the same time as it is a study about the making of images, the circulation and distribution of images, it's also a personal quest with features from detective stories. Michael Rakowitz, the Chicago-based artist who for a number of years has looked at what has happened to historical artifacts in Iraq. His family happens to come from that region. And he has reconstructed a number of the lost ancient sculptures and other objects using packaging material from Baghdad itself. So a way of reclaiming a lost history by lovingly reconstructing them out of highly contemporary material. In the lobby, Natasha Sadr Hagigian, present but not yet active, from from 2002, which is very, very rarely shown at all, because it was more of a performance in secret, or at least not a performance that was not publicized, involving the 3 curators of Manifesta 4 in Frankfurt in 2002, where the artist in the period leading up to the actual exhibition took the curators on excursions to the Frankfurt Zoo, a place which has a strong history in terms of thinking about display and presentation, in order to potentially affect how these professionals would eventually articulate the exhibition as such. The video is a straightforward documentation of certain parts of this process, taking them to the zoo, looking for the tiger, which actually never appears, and reflecting on what it means to make something visible and what it means to make a haven for something, like natural reserves, for instance. And the video was given to the curators before the opening, but it was not included in the show itself. A few other examples. This is a work that I like a lot by Julie Alt and Martin Beck, Display System, which is using the headlines from standard video rental stores in the US in the 90s. So you would have sections like humor, fiction, and also documentary. So this was a way of thinking about documentary somehow transversely in a different manner, how this type of work is categorized in an entirely different context than the art context. So the signs were spread out all over the Center for Curatorial Studies. In the seminar room, when there was no class, Tallinn-based artist Mark Raidpere was showing his 10 Men, which is a rather melancholic and beautiful portrait of 10 inmates at the central prison of Tallinn. Joachim Köster's straightforward photographic series following Aleister Crowley and other mysticists in the 20s in a villa where they used to hang out, which is currently overgrown and dilapidating in other ways as well. And then there was another part. So beside the contemporary projects, which, as you can tell already, were not only lens-based. It was extremely important for me to think about the documentary as something that can be articulated sculpturally, in space, as an installation, and in other ways as well. And then there was this particular resource, which is the Marie-Louise Hessel collection, the starting point of the Center for Curatorial Studies itself. And she happens to have collected quite some documentary photography since the 80s. So I decided to draw on that and to make a St. Petersburg-like installation, or salon-style installation, being generous with lots of work, which is otherwise rarely seen in her context. Her collection is mainly known for painting and installation. And as a heart in the museum space, there was an installation by Olivia Plender that functioned as a discursive space where lectures, screenings, seminars, performances, and panel discussions took place. So it was a way of very literally making the exhibition space also a space for reflection and debate, not unlike the example we saw earlier with Martha Rossler, insisting on actually having such a setup at the very center. And as you can see here, Olivia Plender drew loosely from TV studios, primarily of the 70s, and even borrowed some old equipment and painted other parts directly onto the wall. And this is what it looked like at the opening when Hito Steyrl did a presentation. And a number of the courses that I mentioned being part of the green room were actually held in Olivia Plender's installation. So it was equally central for the Green Room, in addition to wanting to address documentary practices, to address the format of the exhibition and to take this format closely into consideration. So there were spaces that were intimate black box cinema type spaces with screening programs, as well as the other types of installations and presentations that you've just seen. Fikret Atay's Rebels of the Dance, a classic by now from 2002, where the artist just happened to come upon a bunch of young boys hanging out in the ATM machine area of a bank, because it was one of the only indoor places they had access to, and where they were developing their own performances with singing and dancing. So it's typical of this period, just somebody who happens to pass by something, a handheld camera, very shaky, very grainy, but with a strong impact of directness. In the library there were works, for instance Petra Bauer's video on the left, and a few more examples of work that I believe are very, very much to do with thinking about truth claims, to the point of actually being to do with trials, like Nathan Coley's Lockerbie witness box, where the artist spent months participating as an observer at the trial against the alleged terrorists who blew up the plane that fell down on Lockerbie in Scotland, and where he eventually copied some of the evidence with a pencil, doing photorealistic copies. You can see them framed behind the witness stand. The key pieces of evidence were treated in this extremely laborious and almost loving way. And here an interesting footnote is that the artist is completely colorblind, so it must have been quite a challenge for him to, for instance, deal with the receipt of a dry cleaning ticket, as you can see there. And the witness stand box. He ended up making an exact replica of the witness stand box, which eventually has been purchased by the Imperial War Museum in London as part of their collection. Walid Raat, Fact and Fiction, the civil war in Lebanon, and how he has mixed evidence with his own stories, sometimes very imaginative and sometimes quite factual. In this case, the cataloging of all the car bombs happening in Beirut during a certain number of years. Or Emily Jassir. The show even included painting. It's her copying emails from her inbox from a certain period of time through and with the medium of painting. André Sala's Intervista, another classic, where André Sala found a reel of film in his grandparents' attic, and they turned out to show his mother as a young woman. And having watched it, he realized that she appeared with the dictator Enver Hoxha and other hotshots. But as there was no sound to go with the reel, it was hard to tell what was actually going on. And asking her didn't help, because she was reluctant to speak. And he ended up going to somebody who can read lips to try and interpret what was actually happening. So a very powerful piece of film about a particular time in history in Albania, as well as about the relationship between a mother and a son. Omer Fast's reconstruction of Spielberg's list which he did at the very place where the film was made, contacting some of the extras and asking them to once again enact what they had done for the film itself, and where the lines between fact and fiction actually seemed to blur almost entirely, periodically at least. I was intrigued to include this work by Club 2, two artists based in Vienna, because it did not include any imagery. It's obviously any figurative imagery. Obviously it's lens-based in the sense that it then appears on screens, but it's based on studying the reverse of photographs and what they might tell about the actual photograph and the motif, which can be more than what the front reveals. Matthew Buckingham, his one-shot film from a helicopter starting at the tip of Manhattan, flying along the Hudson River, all the way up past Bard College, which is located along the Hudson River, retelling the story of land and how the land has been used, occupied and claimed by different groups, from the indigenous people to the Dutch and the English coming. So here with the documentary, I would just like to go back a little bit and think about the history of documentary. Most of the works that I have shown you here and which were part of the show dealt with history and how it can possibly be represented. It's the complicated and partial conditions, not only for viewing, but also for making history. They were explored. And the ambition in these works often seems to be equally persuasive and poetic. They testify to an urgent need to discuss specific realities, but the artists are aware of the ideologies and structures which govern the tools at hand. To expose the weakness of the classical documentary means is a purpose, and the unreliability of their methods. And that's just one indication of the pervasiveness of the desire to question documentary representations. They take us beyond conventional, empirical, and factual connections to events and conditions. Many of the works and the people behind them feel as comfortable in the exhibition space as at the university department, and they navigate between art historical genres and new documentary formulations. So the documentary as a term, as some of you will remember, was coined by John Grierson in 1926 in an article about the filmmaker Flaherty. The creative treatment of actuality was his definition of the documentary, the creative treatment of actuality. And actually he championed state-sponsored films of edifying character. As a movement and institutional practice, the documentary emerged more clearly in the 1930s. And then it referred to a specific category of documentary film meant to encourage a sense of citizenship, and it was often state-sponsored or funded by corporations sharing the government agenda. Photographic and filmic documents were certainly produced long before that. We know that historically the camera was placed next to registering devices like the thermometer and barometer, and its uses were early on connected to archaeology, meteorology, cartography, and other explorations of territories and the people inhabiting these territories. So a term for this was actualité in French. These short films that were thought of as descriptive tools, reporting about new things, actual things. And this heritage actually weighs, I think, quite heavily on many of the subsequent documentary practices. But documentary practices were also used as an instrument to stimulate discussion and action, as a political tool. So maybe we should think about the documentary as a historical rather than ontological category. So somebody has described that the documentary has three main functions. To be encyclopedic, historically speaking, to be encyclopedic and educational as the first, to preserve heritage and conserve as the second, and to pursue social and practical matters as the third. And maybe this latter one, pursue social and practical matters, become more influential, let's say, in the 20s and 30s. But what's interesting here, I think, is that this genre was immediately, or whatever we call it, this phenomenon was immediately imbued with ambiguity. Both photography and film were becoming more legitimate art forms, and despite the documentary's presumed privileged relationship to real life, it could still be considered as art. In fact, it can be thought of as beyond art and yet part of it, often with an ambition to reform not only art but also the social. It's as if the documentary is given the task of fixing things, reforming art, but also situations in lived real life, so to speak. So I think there are actually quite some similarities between the situation today and that of the documentary in the 30s. And one of the many paradoxes of documentary practices explored by artists today also is that they have, in some contexts and times, come to be understood as automatically critical. Documentary equals being critical. Which is a paradox. Because, of course, documentary practices are constantly used by official powers to control and regiment both people and resources. So, a few thoughts on the documentary before I move over to abstraction. Maybe what's interesting here is actually that many of the artists seem to be more interested and concerned about how an image is being processed than the image itself, or the end result itself. And if that is the case, then it's not unlike how an image in the early 20th century was understood to become documentary through how it was classified and becoming part of an archive rather than stylistic or media-based definitions. And I actually began to think about documentary a little bit as a parallel term to femininity, because they both appear to be natural and self-evident, but of course they are historically constructed in contextually very specific ways. So, for me, working with the green room, and it's already a while ago, it was extremely stimulating to learn about how artists are questioning the truth claims and how they're inventing ways of problematizing this, meaning that the question of how came to the fore. And this led me to thinking more and more about abstraction. When I curate, it tends to be based on observations, quite basic things I see in studios, in exhibition spaces, and other situations, which triggers something once a pattern starts to make itself visible. So as I was working on the green room, this other pattern with many artists dealing with abstraction came to the fore. And what appeared to me to be a similar interest in articulation, in the how question, took very, very different shapes and forms. Eventually, this was put together in a project called Abstract Possible, which had many different iterations, and it's not over yet, I could say. The most recent exhibition manifestation was in Birmingham at the end of 2012. It started with a small trailer exhibition in the project space of Malmö Konsthall in the south of Sweden in 2010, with 5 artists who became a core group of artists appearing in many of the subsequent iterations. It was not a think tank the way the artists functioned with the Green Room, but still people who came back into the project. And those 5 artists were Doug Ashford, Claire Barclay, Wade Guyton, Maitu Perret, and Goldin and Saneby. So I started to trace 3 different strands to do with abstraction. So the most obvious one, formal abstraction. Plenty of artists being interested in the language of primarily geometric abstraction. A lot of it happening in commercial galleries, presumably ending up in people's private homes. Very neat, very beautiful paintings. Less interesting to me than artists harking back to the legacy of the classical avant-garde and the abstract strategies used by artists in the teen, 20s and 30s. And an artist who has indeed looked back at what artists such as Varvara Stepanova and Rodchenko did is Maitu Perret, whose wallpaper is actually drawn from a textile pattern designed by the Moscow constructivist Varvara Stepanova. So what I was more and more curious about was precisely how this formal abstraction appeared now, harking back to historical examples, but then coming to the fore to our time again, twisted, often with some sort of critical slant, as I understood it. Doug Ashford, an enormous curiosity, one of the legendary members of Group Material, the New York collective that was active between 1979 and 1996. He was one of the leading members together with Julie Alt and Felix Gonzalez Torres until he passed away in 96 and the group dissolved. How he, who had worked so much with what we would call social practice and collective work, using the exhibition as a format itself, an artistic form itself, could start to make small abstract paintings. When I first heard about it, it sounded like a mystery. And I had to go and see him in his studio and talk to him about it. And it turned out that he had felt at some point 15 years ago that he was still committed to talking about the social. He was interested in some of the same questions, but the medium of the social did not do it for him anymore. So he couldn't work with it the way he had done it. And then abstraction came up as a continuation of wanting to make a diagram of people who were active in activist circles in New York at the time. And of course, a diagram is a prime example of an abstract representation. How we process large amounts of data in ways that are more easily digestible, let's say. So what we can say about Doug Ashford, that his work is obviously very much to do with formal abstraction, but also with the second strand, which I've talked about as social abstraction, which is to do with the etymology of the term abstraction, abstrahere, to step aside or to step back, to withdraw. Because he withdrew into the studio space and did something which is almost like an icon painter's activity, painting in solitude, enormously laborious processes, hours and hours, because not a single trace of the brush is visible on his paintings. And then thirdly, economic abstraction. Abstraction as in finance economy, late capitalism, and how money is the foremost example of abstraction, something explored by the Stockholm-based duo Goldin and Saneby. So these 3 strands were running through the Abstract Possible project in its different iterations. Here at the Museo Tamayo in Mexico City, with Emily Royston's intriguing poster, Ecstatic Resistance, which she did the first time for Manifesta in Murcia in 2010, and which is based on this diagram where she tries to map what ecstatic resistance can be, that resistance is not necessarily something that is hard and difficult and even boring, but on the other hand, on the other side, it can actually be something extremely pleasurable and intriguing. And in order to make that, to render that a bit more visually palpable, she has developed this diagram. Ecstatic Resistance has been a series of exhibitions, some artworks of her own, group exhibitions that she has curated, but it's in a way also like a proto-philosophy or something. I'm just going to run you through some of the installation shots. This is Mexico City still, Tamayo Museum. A small version in Zurich with only 2 artists, Wade Guyton and Tommy Stöckel. And then a big version in Stockholm at Tensta Konsthall, the first show that I curated when I started there almost 5 years ago, where it actually happened in 3 different venues. So formal abstraction was concentrated at the Konsthall, at the Art Center's exhibition space. The withdrawal strategies, or the social abstraction, were presented or underlined in a seminar room at the university, at the Center for Fashion Studies. I'm going to walk you through these quickly. This is still at Tensta Konsthall, so more or less the formal abstraction is emphasized. And the third one, exploring and embodying economic abstraction, took place at an auction house in the city center. And the works were for sale at set prices, not as auctions. And the fee that I got for curating this was used to produce this report that Ada mentioned at the beginning, Contemporary Art and its Commercial Markets, a report on current conditions and future scenarios. So another feature of the auction house presentation was that I was not responsible for the installation. Neither was I responsible for mediating this part, because I had invited Golden and Seneby to articulate the presentation at the auction house. And they in turn decided that I was going to be removed once the artists were selected, and instead the team of the auction house would do what they always do. They would install, they would talk about the project. So it would be business as usual, with one little exception, which was that as soon as a work was being sold, it should be made visible somehow. And that gesture was to take down the work from the wall or from the podium as soon as it was sold. So you can see an empty space at the back where just the spotlight is shining on the wall. There had been a photograph by Zachary Formwalt there before. So what happened here with Abstract Possible and my interest in abstraction, which has also manifested itself in a reader in the MIT Whitechapel series, Documents in Contemporary Art, is a focus on the question of how, and a growing feeling that this is an absolutely central question of our time. Of course, the how question has always been at the core of artistic practice. It's about how something is shaped, how something is articulated. That's to a large extent what is typical of art. But it now seems to take on a higher significance in other contexts as well. And I would say particularly when it comes to the new social movements, for example, Occupy Wall Street and other similar initiatives, where it's clear that it's not about one strong message, but more central is precisely how something is being done, how people are coming together, how something is articulated. So I will just end here by showing an image from Hito Steyrel's recent film Liquidity, Inc. Because it seems to me that she is somewhat a litmus paper in many ways, and her work has, to me, shown signs of things that become more apparent slightly later. For instance, her early work from the years after 2000, including November, were really pointing to this massive wave of documentary practices as the ones that I described in the Green Room project. And now, obviously, she's moving on, and online culture and other concerns to do with how images are being produced and circulated today as different from, let's say, in 2008 when the Green Room was made. So the installation Liquidity, Inc. Is a video about the formless, floating, violent, and simultaneously vital water. Water gushes out of television screens and iPhone screensavers. It functions both as a liquid and as an exhaustible metaphor, the liquefied form of capital, the dot-com bubble when it bursts. And as often before, she's using montage as her idiom, but adding an installation component, not as theatrical as the one in Venice in the German pavilion, but still dramatized enough. And the video tells the story of Jacob Wood, a martial arts enthusiast who lost his job when Lehman Brothers went bankrupt during the 2008 financial crisis. So it's definitely to do with economic abstraction. Wood was born during the Vietnam War and came to the US as part of President Gerald Ford's Operation Baby Lift, an extensive adoption program in which several thousands of homeless and orphan children were adopted from Vietnam and brought to the United States. Wood's story is interspersed with footage from boxing matches and weather disasters, the artist's own chat conversations, and images from an ocean and a horizon where the water seems to speak in its own typeface. I am water, I'm not from here, it says. So the digital images evoke unexpected, elegant, and sometimes unpleasant associations. A recurring image depicts animated bodies that fall lifeless into the depth. Another, more surreal element is the weather report, or perhaps the state of the world report, where a person, the person you can see here, dressed in a black balaclava, rebelliously comments on the trade winds. I'm quoting, "Your emotions affect the weather," says the anchor in front of a world map, where all boundaries are defined and laid bare, revealing the collapsed states, the stateless, the plundered. So, something that Hito Steyrel has said recently, I think, pertains to what the symposium today wants to do, which is what the documentary can mean today, where it seems as if documents are now rather data, are now rather impersonal than personal. She says this: "I'm still thinking about the documentary as before, just in a much wider context. Most of the documentary images today are not just invisible, but inaccessible to the human senses, because they are made by machines, for machines. This is the main realm of the documentary today. It consists of energy that is not available to human perception. How does one deal with that? And how does one deal with the documentaries that are, in effect, post-human? This is not sci-fi, but the vast majority of all data relating to something real is not made to be perceived by humans, not even through special interfaces. It's machines chatting, handshaking, bots blaring, high-frequency trades conducted via shortened fiber optic cables, Metadata skimmed off your phone to threat model your patterns of life. So what is our relationship to these images, and what is their relationship to reality? This can be shifting all the time, and much more so than with the so-called indexable images. That's Hito style. Thank you.